It's time to talk about transitions. And not the fun, exciting, affirming your inner being sort of transitions, but just getting from activity A to activity B. Failure to account for transitions leads to a chronic experience of urgency, sense of frustration, and a lot of social friction. This happens in two main ways in my life. There's failing to account for transitions leading into activities, which causes me to start those activities later than I intend to, which if you are working with somebody else tends to mean that you are late. But even if you're just working by yourself, what it means is that the amount of time that you allocated to do a given task is probably insufficient because there's all this unaccounted for time in the build up to the core activity. So you end up with an incomplete end result. And so you constantly have the experience of starting things and not finishing them, and therefore not getting to enjoy whatever the finished product is, which is profoundly frustrating. On the other side, the failure to account for transitions out of activities leads to leaving behind messes of various descriptions, both in the materials used to perform the activity and the spaces within which the activity occurs. Again, that's really frustrating if you're dealing with other people because other people don't like it when you leave behind messes, but it's also just as an individual experience, incredibly frustrating because you constantly have the experience of past you stealing time from present you. Because when you fail to do teardown activities and fail to clean up spaces, what inevitably happens is you come back to those activities and those spaces and you discover there's a mess here that takes substantially more time to clean up to get ready to start whatever activity I'm about to do than it would have taken to just properly attend to during the teardown phase of the last effort. So in order to fix this, we do need to make the changes in software, and that means having a better model. So let's look at a model of a doing. Some activity needs to be done. What does that involve in the abstract? There are 5 pieces as I see it. There's preparation, which is all of the things that you need to do to get the space ready for a doing to occur. So bringing supplies into place, getting tools ready, all of those sorts of things. There's setup, which is, okay, what is the core activity and what pieces need to be in place before you can start it? There's the core activity itself. That's the thing we're all excited about, right? That's what we're here to do. Then there's tear down, which is getting all of the tools and materials back into a state that they can be used immediately in the future. And there's cleanup, which is getting the space itself into a state where it can be put to other uses. So to do a quick run through of how this would look, step by step, the things that I would need to account for if I wanted to paint a miniature, I have the prep, which means I need to make sure that I have something to put my miniature on. I need to make sure that I have the correct brushes and paints available, that I have a plan in place for how I'm going to execute my scheme, that I have the miniature itself in my paint station. Uh, all of that is getting ready the space, making sure that everything is to hand and ready to go. Then there's the setup. So I actually have to either put the miniature together, clean the model up, um, lay out my palette, or set up my airbrush. All of the things that are required to take the materials and bring them up to a level where they're ready to actually commence the main work of the activity. Then there's the core activity. That's putting paint on a miniature. Pretty straightforward. And that's the thing, the only thing that my brain will intuitively account for when I'm allocating time. So um, I have a clear picture of that. It's everything else. Then there's the teardown. So that is things like making sure that the miniature is in a state where it can be stored safely. So, making sure I've allocated time for varnishing after painting, for example, making sure that all of my tools are in an appropriate state that I can just pick them up and use them later. So soaping up my brushes to get all of the paints out of them, running the appropriate solvents through the airbrush, throwing away the parchment layer of my wet palette, and then making sure to clean out the sponge layer of my wet palette if it's got any paint stuck in it, and wringing it out so that it won't be super wet while it's being stored. All of that sort of stuff. And then the cleanup is, okay, now that I have attended to all of my tools, how do I get this space into a situation where it could be usable for another activity, or if another person needs to use it? And so that means putting all of my paints back into their correct locations, making sure that the miniature is stored out of the way, putting the wet palette back in its storage space, putting my airbrush back into its box, and then putting it into its appropriate storage location. Those are all of the steps that are involved in a painting session, and making sure that I actively take the time to allocate the time to bring the materials together. That's going to take 10 minutes to set up the tools. Oh, okay, well, that's going to take, depending upon the miniature and the paint plan, anywhere between 10 and 15 minutes to an hour. It can get a little bit involved. The core activity itself, given the limits of my dexterity, I have some damage to my wrist and whatnot. I'm probably not painting for more than 90 minutes. And then tear down, getting all the tools in their appropriate configuration is probably going to take about 20 minutes, and clean up is probably going to take about another 10. So we have half an hour on the back side and potentially an hour on the front side around this activity, which is itself going to be about 90 minutes. So if I want to have a 90-minute paint session, I probably need to allocate 150 minutes to it. I would not get there without the model, without thinking it through. So already it's very helpful just to have the ability to have 5 boxes to plug a value into, so that I can have a better sense of whether or not I can actually fit this activity within the space of time that I have available in my life. Let's talk about some other considerations here. Some other fixes that can be helpful for correctly accounting for transitions, or to make a distinction mentally between agreed upon public timelines and your personal timelines. So if you know that you struggle with certain sorts of transitions, making sure that your accounting takes that into consideration. So if I know that I really struggle to leave the house, if I've agreed to meet somebody at noon and I know that transit's going to be half an hour, then I need to make sure that I give myself, say, 45 minutes before the half an hour before the meeting that I need to leave, because I know that at the last moment I'm going to desperately struggle to find some needed item or whatnot. It's just the way that my life works. So having that distinction between here's the public timeline that I've agreed upon, and then I have a private timeline that takes into account all of the foibles of my being, and making that structure explicit for oneself can be really helpful. Then setting alarms to remind you to do transitions on your personal timeline. So I don't need an alarm for the time that I need to leave the house. I need an alarm for 45 minutes before I leave the house, and then half an hour before I leave the house, and then 15 minutes before I leave the house, because I will have gotten distracted in there somewhere. But having those structures to provide the reminders that this is an area of struggle for you and a place where you need to practice, and therefore let's get this together before it becomes a problem, before you're in an experience of urgency and, oh my gosh, I'm going to be late and people are going to be upset with me. That's a great help. Making a conscious decision to be kind to yourself and give yourself the opportunity to escape from urgency is a really important part of this. It's worth the effort to cut against the grain, to work against the natural and intuitive model that we have of time management, when that model has been shown by a whole lifetime of experience to be deficient. Uh, but that is not free. The training, the practice takes time and effort and will involve failure and frustration. And those are emotional burdens that we have to consciously decide to take on, because it's worth it to escape the experience of chronic urgency and of ultimately people being disappointed in us. And if possible, communicate to those other peoples the challenges that you are experiencing and the steps that you are taking to rectify the issues that arise from those challenges. It's very easy, if we don't give people information about the struggles that we face, for them to project an unhelpful and judgmental view upon it. That instead of a person struggling with the difficulties of a mismatch between how their brain processes something intuitively and how things actually work. There's a person who's making a conscious choice not to make an effort to be on time, to keep things tidy, to avoid messes and whatnot. And if you have a person who's just going, I don't care about other people, I'm just going to leave a mess everywhere and always be late, that's not a person that you are going to feel a tremendous amount of sympathy towards. But if you have a person who has an underlying dysfunction in their processing model that they haven't been given the tools to address and to cope with, that's somebody who you can be sympathetic to. So open the door to others being sympathetic to your struggles by giving them the information about what your struggles are and giving them the information about how it is you are attempting to address them, so that when they see you making the effort and probably, let's be honest, failing quite a bit, um, their interest is to help instead of piling on. And like so many things, a practice of acceptance is very important to making the transition to effectively transitioning. Just understanding that starting and stopping are part of the activity, and that you're going to experience frustration at not getting to the good part if your brain has a model that just doesn't include those beginning and end parts as the focus, the thing that is generating the excitement. So just accepting that and accepting that the emotional consequences of that mismatch are going to be irksome. Can also be very helpful to take the time to account for productivity that happens during transitions. So, for example, when it occurred to me that I could do a video about transitions, I decided I'm going to go work on the script for that at 1 p.m. And about 1:15, I was in the kitchen making myself breakfast and doing dishes while my eggs cooked. And that's not overtly working on the script for a video. Um, but I've cooked eggs a lot of time in my life and I've done a lot of dishes, so I don't actually require 100% of my mind to be engaged in those activities in order to see them through to a successful conclusion. So I was thinking about what I wanted to say and how I might compose it while I was working on those other tasks. And those other tasks were very necessary because when it's time to sit down at a computer and type, avoiding distraction requires that I be both nourished and not have a bunch of house chores hanging over my head. Otherwise, I'm going to get into an unfortunate sort of dissociative experience and fail to stay on the task at hand. So feeding myself appropriately and taking care of that nagging chore were part of the setup for doing productive intellectual work. And I interleaved some other portion of that intellectual work into that setup. So I should get credit for that. And having the conscious um, awareness that credit needs to be allocated to productivity that happens during those transitional periods that don't necessarily look like working on the core activity uh, is very helpful. So making sure that when you are starting late, but you have actually been doing some background work towards the activity during the startup period, that you get credit for that. It's very helpful psychologically. Make sure to use scheduling rules and structures wherever possible to account for transitions in general without necessarily needing to account for them in detail. So, for example, when I'm scheduling clients, I just always leave half an hour in between each client meeting because I know that there's going to be miscellaneous setup and teardown from meeting with a client. I need to send an email with notes about the meeting, or I need to follow up with um, another client who's emailed me while I was in the meeting, or I need to research something to assist uh, with a future session, or I just need to set up my apparatus to be ready to teach the next client. That takes time, and I'm not going to think about it. So if I just have a rule in place that says you cannot schedule clients back to back, you have to have an half an hour in between, that by default is going to account for the fact that I'm probably not going to properly think through the scheduling implications of stacking clients one after another. And that saves me from the experience of either having to cut a meeting short of where I would like to, because we haven't, it's okay, it's 7 p.m. on the dot, and I have another client that I need to start with right now, but we haven't really gotten to a nice, tidy place to wrap up this material. Um, I don't like that. It's very upsetting to me. It's very stressful. Um, or I'm going to be late to the next meeting. Uh, And I can't win on either side of that. So having a structure that prevents me from arriving in a situation that is fundamentally a no-win is very kind. And at the bottom of the motivation here is the desire to be kind to myself and to be kind to others. I deserve it to escape from the experience of urgency, and that's what practicing effective transitions offers to me. And other people deserve to not be burdened by the deficit that my brain has in properly accounting for this. Oh, parks are nice. Golly. Oh, I gotta pee. Let's go home.